Maybe some of you don't know that we record lectures, so maybe you're here under false pretenses, but either way, I'm really glad that you're here. I think it's better to come in person. It's more exciting for me to have people here in real life and live in person, so I'm really grateful. This is the first of a four-part series we're having at the shul on great Jewish renegades. The thinking was, I had spent a couple of years giving lectures on great rabbis, great Torah commentators, of the medieval period, of the modern period, and exploring their thought and their lives. And I really enjoyed doing that, and I hope to continue that series. And the truth is, I've been here long enough, I could revisit some of the ones that I taught about my first year. None of you came to the class on Rashi in 2013, right? So I think I can definitely do that again. Also, some of the most kind of famous Jewish individuals have really been, in some sense, renegades. They've really not been pious Torah scholars. Their contributions to Judaism and their contributions to the world has not been as loyal Jews, but as something different in some way. And so we're going to explore four of these figures who had tremendous influence on the world, and we're going to explore their impact on the world, and also what role Judaism played in their lives, even as they were not faithful, observant Jews per se, and also maybe what their message might be useful to us, those of us who are Jewish. Okay, what of their legacy can be useful. So we're starting with Freud. A whole bunch of books, some of which I hope to read more carefully than I ended up having time to do. I told my wife that I had not really prepared as much as I hoped I would, and she said, "Well, your whole life has been preparation for this lecture." She meant that I was raised by two psychoanalysts. My mother is a practicing psychoanalyst. My father was a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist, and they are both trained in Freudian analysis. They are, I think they call themselves modern Freudians, which I think is like a little bit like being modern Orthodox. That's my sense. So even though I kind of grew up with a lot of psychoanalysts. Like that was my the social context of my childhood. Like that was, I think there were all of my parents' friends were mental health professionals, psychotherapists, social workers, analysts of some kind or another. There were two lawyers who married in. That was it. That was it. None were observant Jews. Everyone was Jewish. Like, I don't think I knew. Right. I had an exclusively Jewish, social environment of my parents' friends, but none were observed. So that is like part of this cultural phenomenon that we're going to explore. So let's say a little bit about Freud. We're going to say a little bit about his thinking, look at some of his writings, a few little snippets of his writings that I thought would be interesting, and then a little bit about Freud's Jewish identity, and then a little bit at the end, how can Freudian theory be useful for Torah scholarship? Okay, so the basic contours of Freud's life. He was born in 1856 in Freiburg, in Central Europe. His father was a wool merchant. He was not a very successful wool merchant. The family moved to Vienna when Freud was young, and that's where Freud. That's where he grew up. That's where he went to school. He went to medical school. Was initially interested in more, I guess we would call neurology, and then over time, his interest shifted into what we would call psychology, and in the 1880s he discovers what would eventually come to be known as psychoanalysis. As he's sort of making the shift, he marries Martha Bernay. Martha Bernay was the granddaughter of Chacham Bernay, who was a rabbi in Hamburg. He was one of the first Orthodox rabbis to go to college. He was a very, very important figure in modern Jewish history and the history of modern Orthodoxy, and one of his granddaughters was Martha Bernay, who married Freud in 1886. So she grew up in a much more she grew up in an observant Orthodox home, and she, when she married Freud, she was no longer observant, but she had a much more observant childhood than Freud did. Freud's parents were very Jewish identified, but were not. I think Freud's father already was raised in a very religious Reform Jewish household that was very Jewish identified, but not in the Reform style in Central Europe at that time. 1885, he studies with the Charcot, one of the earliest people in neurology, psychiatry, as this field was developing. 1895, he publishes his studies in hysteria. That's sort of where hysteria was a condition that, it's a diagnosis that isn't given anymore. It was an affliction that women were diagnosed with in the 19th century. And Freud, with some of his colleagues, Bernet and Breuer, and sort of realized that a series of physical symptoms that had been associated with hysteria seemed to have psychological causes, and that through talking about things, the symptoms could be relieved. And this is what came to be known as the talking cure. Okay, there was the earliest patient who was described, Anna O, what's her name, and she had a series of symptoms that recurred again and again and again, but by talking about her childhood and the symptoms and her feelings and just talking, the symptoms seemed to be relieved. And this was expanded upon in psychoanalysis as a method of treatment, as a method of that the patient would talk, free associate, would and come to realize the symbolic nature of the symptom. Right? If I'm saying things I think are maybe familiar, right? The symbolic nature of the symptoms, the symbolic, the symbolic nature of behavior, what are childhood traumas, unresolved issues, and so and so. And then over time, they developed a whole language, a whole theory of psychic, like a psychic drama, the Oedipal complex, right? A son's competition with his father for his mother's love, and these sort of primal processes that children go through at young ages that leave unresolved issues that all of us are grapple with as adults. That our minds are not. Our conscious minds are not the only part of our minds. There's an unconscious mind. Things, right? Our minds, which we think we're in the driver's seat, we think we're in control, but there's an unconscious element that is also motivating our behavior and dictating our behavior that we're not aware of. And through analysis, through psychoanalysis, you can gain insight into what some of those unconscious dynamics are within the mind of the patient, can kind of come to realize that for himself and for herself. And so you have the ego, which is your executive function. You have the id, which is your more primal urges and maybe destructive, maybe self-destructive urges. And then the superego is the force of morality and control and battle, and the ego then is left to contend with the desires of the id and the moral voice of the superego, and out of that dynamic, all of that's all churning inside us, and often beneath the surface, or not fully, nothing that we're not fully aware of. And as these processes play out, if they're not, sometimes we sublimate, right? We don't, because we're not responding to something really true about ourselves. They can manifest themselves in symptoms. So. A phobia, or some sort of self-destructive behavior, or some recurrent relationship dynamic that seems to leave us unfulfilled. And why are we doing it? Well, maybe it's a sublimation. Maybe it's a way that these unresolved forces can break through. Okay, and it's not supposed to be like a summary. It's like a very, very brief overview of a vast literature. And I think much of the specifics of the Freudian theory, like especially Oedipus complex and castration anxiety, and some of those specific theories, I think, are no longer as prominent even amongst those who would call themselves Freudian psychoanalysts. But the idea that there's like a psychodynamic, there are hidden and conflicting drives that we're not aware of, but that nonetheless are impacting our lives and shaping our choices. I think that is the piece that's been much more enduring, even if the specific forces that Freud described are, I think, maybe no longer taken quite as seriously. And I think there are people here. I mean, there are mental health professionals and mental health, psychology students in the room who know more about this than I do. So if you feel that I'm like misstating something, you should say something. But I'm trying to be what? Objective. No, I'm not. I'm trying to be brief. Okay. 1905 on the interpretation of dreams is published. It's a fun book if you never. It's you can. It's not like you don't have to be. You don't need to have a degree in psychology or a medical degree to appreciate that book. It's a classic. How are dreams a way in which we can have some awareness of some unconscious drives and thoughts. 1920, beyond the pleasure principle, and some of his later, after World War I, Freud, surveying the destruction of European civilization, the self-destruction of European civilization, he realizes that it's not just, human beings don't just seek pleasure, and we don't just have a pleasure-seeking sexual libido. We also have a death instinct as well, and these two forces are kind of within us and within civilization as a whole. And so that's the dynamic that plays out in our lives and in civilization as a whole. This pleasure-seeking principle and this death-seeking drive as well, this self-destructive drive, and that sort of he came to that awareness in the aftermath of the First World War. His last book, Moses and Monotheism, is a somewhat, say idiosyncratic theory of the origins of Judaism and the Jewish faith. He claims that Moses was an Egyptian prince who was a last holdout of the monotheistic faith that the pharaoh Akhenaten had embraced. Right? There was an Egyptian pharaoh, a long time before Abraham. This is true. This part is not. This is true and known in history. There was an Egyptian pharaoh who embraced monotheism and embraced the worship of only one of the Egyptian panoply of gods. And after his death, that monotheistic religion in Egypt sort of basically died off, and they went back to worshiping all the old gods that they had worshipped before him. And Freud surmised that there was a holdout, a believer in this Egyptian monotheism who wanted to keep that faith alive, and he, went to the Hebrew slaves and led them out of Egypt so that he could keep alive this monotheistic faith. The Hebrews killed him, and out of guilt of that murder, they embraced the religion that he had taught them, and that is the origin of. So this is not. This was never really embraced by historians or biblical. It has some interesting elements of it that have some he's not the first one to surmise to suggest some of the ideas, but the book was never taken very seriously as a history or anthropology or archaeology, but it was but is a really interesting look into Freud grappling with the meaning of Judaism, and it seems he was working on that book for many, many years and delayed publishing it because he was worried it would stoke anti-Semitism because it's undermining some foundations of biblical narrative. He's worried it would undermine Jewish pride, which is maybe an element that he felt some ambivalence about undermining. And he saw, that because he saw himself in this chain of, first Copernicus taught us that the sun does not revolve around the earth. The universe does not revolve around it. And then Darwin came and taught us that humanity is not the center of creation, but we are part of creation and descend, through evolutionary descent like every other creature. And then Freud. And then he thought he himself came and we deposed the rational ego as we are not even in control of ourselves, right? We have all these unconscious forces that are actually impacting our decisions. We're not rational, logical beings who make rational choices as we imagine ourselves to be, And then he thought, with Moses and monotheism, I'm even taking away from the Jews their own religion, because I'm saying that it was an Egyptian gave it to them. They didn't even take it. So but he did publish it in 1939, shortly before his death. He died in London. He had at the very, really at the last minute, he fled Vienna after the Nazis took over. So let's dive in. So that's a brief overview. On the first page, I have a quote which is just incredible. Okay, 1930, his book Totem and Taboo is translated into Hebrew and published in Israel, and he wrote a preface to the Hebrew edition. And this is what he wrote: "No reader of the Hebrew version of this book will find it easy to put himself in the emotional position of an author who is ignorant of the language of Holy Writ, who is completely estranged from the religion of his fathers as well as from every other religion, and who cannot take share in nationalist ideals, but who has never repudiated his people, who feels that he is in his essential nature a Jew, and who has no desire to alter that nature. If the question were put to him, since you have abandoned all these common characteristics of your compatriots, what is left of you that is Jewish, he would reply a very great deal, and probably its very essence. He could not now express that essence in words, but someday, no doubt, it will become accessible to the scientific mind. There's something essentially Jewish that Freud embraced and was proud of, that he couldn't name, but felt, with some scientific, maybe psychoanalytic investigation, there could be, what is it in Jewish history, what is it about our culture, about it, right, that is different and distinct, and he was very proud of that. So fascinating. I think it's an incredible quote of a kind of,
Did he ever express this publicly in the 30s that I'm Jewish?
So it's complicated. It's complicated. Yes and no. Yes. I mean, this was published. This was the preface of a book, so it's not like a secret. Let's get there. So first, I want to share just a few passages from. This is in terms of Freud's theory himself. This is a book. Jonathan Lear is at. He's at University of Chicago, right? He's sort of like also a modern Freudian. He sort of takes Freudian theory as part of the tradition of. Not necessarily, not limiting it to a theory of psychology as in a medical, therapeutic framework, but really in a philosophical framework. So this is from the book that's on the table here, page 2 in your packets. Yet for all that, it seems to me clear that at his best, Freud is a deep explorer of the human condition, working in a tradition which goes back to Sophocles and which extends to Plato, St. Augustine, and Shakespeare, to Proust and Nietzsche. What holds this tradition together is its insistence that there are significant meanings for human well-being which are obscured from immediate awareness. Sophoclean tragedy locates another realm of meaning in a divine world which humans can at most glimpse through oracles. In misunderstanding these strange meanings, humans usher in catastrophe. Right? In Greek tragedy, what's the cause of tragedy? We think we're in control. Oedipus thinks he can take control of his destiny by running away from his parents. But what does he in fact do? In fact, he kills his father and marries his mother because he thinks that he knows everything, but really the gods are in control. Freud's achievement from this perspective is to locate these meanings fully inside the human world. Humans make meaning for themselves and for others of which they have no direct or immediate awareness. People make more meaning than they know what to do with. This is what Freud meant by the unconscious. And whatever valid criticisms can be aimed at him or at the psychoanalytic profession, it is nevertheless true that psychoanalysis is the most sustained and successful attempt to make these obscure meanings intelligible. Since I believe that this other source of meaning is of great importance for human development, I think that psychoanalytic theory is invaluable for those who can make use of it. But crazy as this may seem, I also believe that psychoanalysis is crucial for a truly democratic culture to thrive. We have to understand, right? There's more to our lives than what's apparent on that, right? I mean, why do people vote against their self-interest? Okay, why do self-destructive and violent urges course through a culture and manifest themselves in electoral politics in surprising ways that don't seem to defy rationality? Okay, right? Right. So it's not, maybe it's the gods, okay, and worrying about and fate, or maybe there's something. Maybe there's meaning in human lives and that things that motivate us that aren't apparent to us at first glance. Page 4. How then might we set appropriate standards of confirmation for casual claims in psychoanalysis, right? So this genuine and important question tends to be brushed aside by the cliche of the analyst telling a patient who disagrees with an interpretation which she is just resisting, right? Like psychoanalysis is not really science, because if you just say, no, I disagree, analyst, with what you just interpreted, yeah, well, that's what you're just resisting. Of course you would disagree, okay? The apotheosis of this cliche can be found in Sir Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies, in which Popper argues that psychoanalysis is a pseudoscience because its discoveries cannot be falsified. What counts as evidence is too large and elusive for the total claim of the discipline to be either checked or challenged. Of course, in this broad sense, nothing could falsify history or economics or our ordinary psychological interpretation of persons, but no one would think of calling these forms of explanation pseudo. And there is something which would count as a global refutation of psychoanalysis. If people always and everywhere acted in rational and transparently explicable ways, one could easily dismiss psychoanalysis as unnecessary rubbish. It is because people often behave in bizarre ways which cause pain to themselves and to others, ways which puzzle even the actors themselves, that psychoanalysis commands our attention. Okay, that is the big push, right? It is to investigate what are these symbols of my life? What are the patterns in my behavior? Where do they come from? What internal dynamic gives rise to these behaviors? The fact that we act in ways that are inexplicable to ourselves and to others, that cause pain to ourselves and to others, and that animates this journey, which is, again, maybe in the tradition of Sophocles and Shakespeare rather than in the history, from a medical therapeutic framework, but it sort of gives rise to this discipline. Okay. I thought you'd find it interesting, page 5. This is a fun little essay that Freud, again, in terms of his fixation on a Jewish figure, he was fixated on Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses, right? And he wrote an essay where he visited the sculpture, and he spent a long time absorbed by it, and he wrote this essay. You can see he asked an artist to write a picture. To try to explain, right? So figure D, that's how Moses is holding the tablets in Michelangelo's sculpture. Okay? And there it is, figure 3, that's Michelangelo's Moses. So he realized that there had to have been, it's an awkward way to hold the tablets. And so Freud suggests that Michelangelo's Moses was sitting in figure 1, that's pretty normal, right? And then he sees the golden calf, that's figure 2. And he's so startled, maybe angry, that the tablets are dropping. Figure 3, he's rushing to catch them. Okay? So the sculpture captures a moment of Moses not shattering the tablets, but actually keeping them safe and stopping them from falling. Okay? Right? So there's a whole, look at page 277 okay? It's to prevent this that the right hand retreats, lets go of the beard, a part of which is drawn back with it unintentionally, comes against the top edge of the tables in time, and grips them near the hind quarter. Next page. Which has now come uppermost. Thus, the singularly constrained air of the whole, beard, hands, and tilted tables can be traced at one passionate movement of the hand and its natural consequences. If we wish to reverse the effects of those stormy movements, we must raise the upper front corner, blah, 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 blah. I procured from the hand of an artist 3 drawings to illustrate my meaning, blah, 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 blah. Okay, section 3, page 279. We may now, I believe, permit ourselves to reap the fruits of our endeavors. We have seen how many of those who have felt the influence of this statue have been impelled to interpret it as representing Moses, agitated by the spectacle of the people fallen from grace and dancing round an idol. But this interpretation had to be given up, for it made us expect to see him spring up in the next moment, break the tables and accomplish the work of vengeance. Such a conception of it would fail to harmonize with the design of making this figure, together with 3 or 5 more seated figures as part of the tomb of Julius II. We may now take up again the abandoned interpretation, for the Moses we have reconstructed will neither leap up nor cast the tables from him. What we see before us is not the inception of a violent action, but the remains of a movement that has already taken place. In his first transport of fury, Moses desired to act, to spring up and take vengeance, and forgot the tables, but he has overcome the temptation, and he will now remain seated and still in his frozen wrath and in his pain mingled with contempt. Nor will he throw away the tables so that they will break on the stones, for it is on their especial account that he has controlled his anger. It was to preserve them that he kept his passion in check, and giving way to his rage and indignation, he had to neglect the tables, and the hand which upheld them was withdrawn. They began to slide down, or in danger of being broken. This brought him to himself. He remembered his mission and renounced it for its sake and indulgence of his feelings. His hand returned and saved the unsupported tables before they had actually fallen to the ground. In this attitude, he remained immobilized. Okay, so skip a paragraph. But here it will be objected that after all this is not the Moses of the Bible. For that Moses did actually fall into a fit of rage and did throw away the tables and break them. This Moses would be a quite different man, a new Moses of the artist's conception, so that Michelangelo must have had the presumption to amend the sacred text and to falsify the character of that holy man. Can we think him capable of a boldness which might almost be said to approach an act of blasphemy? So he says yes. Okay? That's again, this is relatively early, this is many years before Moses and monotheism, but you see him like really fascinated by the character of Moses, right? By this artistic representation of Moses, and he, I don't know, like through his knowledge of anatomy or physics or like the way in which the tablets are being held, he kind of reconstructs a whole scene which diverges from the way the Torah tells the story. Kind of cool, right? So yeah.
What does the last sentence mean? Do you think I'm capable of boldness?
I think that means, who would have thought, right? Who would have thought that Michelangelo would amend the text of the Bible in making a sculpture that describes the opposite of what the Bible describes? Okay, another selection. Go to page 8. It's 1928. Okay, he got a letter. This is an account of an exchange with an American physician. What struck me most was your answer to the question whether you believe in a survival of personality after death. You are reported as having said, "I give no thought to the matter." I am writing now to tell you of an experience that I had in the year I graduated at the University of X. One afternoon while I was passing through the dissecting room, my attention was attracted to a sweet-faced dear-old woman who was being carried to a dissecting table. The sweet-faced woman made such an impression on me that a thought flashed up in my mind. There is no God. If there was a God, he would not have allowed this dear old woman to be brought to the dissecting room. When I got home that afternoon, the feeling I had at the sight of the dissecting room had determined me to discontinue going to church. The doctrines of Christianity had been the subject of doubts in my mind. While I was meditating on this matter, a voice spoke to my soul that I should consider the step I was about to take. My spirit replied to this inner voice by saying, if I knew of a certainty, next page, page 9, that Christianity was truth and the Bible is the Word of God, then I would accept it. In the course of the next few days, God made it clear to my soul that the Bible was His Word, that teaching about Jesus were true, and that Jesus was our only hope. And after such a clear revelation, I accepted the Bible. I beg you, as a brother physician, to give thought to this most important matter, and I can assure you, if you look into this subject with an open mind, God will reveal the truth to your soul, the same as He did to me and to multitudes of others. Okay? That's the letter Freud received. I sent a polite letter saying that I was glad to hear that this experience had enabled him to retain his faith. As for myself, God had not done so much for me. He had never allowed me to hear an inner voice, and if, in view of my age, He did not make haste, it would not be my fault if I remained to the end of my days, life what I am now, an infidel Jew. In the course of a friendly reply, my colleague gave me an assurance that being a Jew was not an obstacle in the pathway to true faith, and proved this by several instances. His letter culminated in the information that prayers were being earnestly addressed to God that He might grant me faith to believe. I am still awaiting the outcome of this intercession. In the meantime, my colleague's religious experience provides food for thought. It seems to me to demand some attempt at an interpretation based upon emotional motives, for his experience is puzzling in itself and is based on particularly bad logic. God, as we know, allows horrors to take place of a kind very different from the removal to a dissecting room of the dead body of a pleasant-looking old woman. This has been true at all times, and it must have been so while my American colleague was pursuing his studies. Nor, as a medical student, can he have been so sheltered from the world as to know nothing of such evils. Why was it then that his indignation against God broke out precisely when he received this particular impression on the dissecting room? And he goes on, you can read the next, I guess I don't have the entire essay. He goes on to explain it as a kind of Oedipal function. The old, pleasant-looking old woman reminded him of his mother, and the voice of God was the sort of voice of his father, and that was the Oedipal process in which the child, is competing with the father for the love of the mother, and then comes to identify with the father, who, of course, then is, that's the paradigm of God is that also that same kind of father figure in his psychological conception. So I thought that was also interesting, okay? Comments so far? Anything let's move on.
So Freud was living in London all this time?
No. He was in Vienna. He was in Vienna. He moved to London only at the end of his life. Not even a year. He came to America once, I think in the 20s. He was invited to Clark University to give a lecture. He remarked, America is amazing, but it's a mistake. Chapter 10 begins a few selections from this book. This is the Yale University has this series of short biographies of famous Jewish people called the Jewish Lives series. I've read a few of them. They're good. So it's Adam Phillips, Becoming Freud. It really is like the first 40 years of his life. A very kind of close look at the first 40 years of his life. And he has some very interesting, put some of his biography into an interesting context of Jewish history. Look at the bottom, page 18. You will need to notice that what Freud used the language of psychoanalysis to talk about: childhood, sexuality, aggression, humor, the unconscious, memory, biography, religion, science, and to mostly avoid talking about politics, philosophy, economics, class, fashion, mysticism, old age. We will have to see, in other words, which of the cultural conversations of the time Freud wanted to join and which he avoided, what Freud needed psychoanalysis to liberate himself from, and what kind of imprisonment it liberated him for. Okay? That's kind of neat, right? In the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, in Freud's lifetime, Europe was radically transformed, and in ways in which we can only just begin to understand or even to get glimpses of it. It was not a world turned upside down, but a world less coherent, less able to be pictured than that. Freud's life and psychoanalysis itself are glimpses of those times, and once a product of those times, and Freud's protests against them, the choices he made. Okay. Page 11 in your packets. Perhaps the most important thing about Freud's family is that they were immigrants in the Vienna that Freud spent most of his life in. Freud's youth, as to say, from the age of 4, was that of an immigrant, a resident alien. And psychoanalysis is first and foremost a psychology of and for immigrants. Why? People who can never quite settle. Not a Jewish science, as Freud feared, but an immigrant science for a world in which, for political and economic reasons, there were to be more and more immigrants. Okay? So Phillips is suggesting that the image of the Freudian person who is not fully in control, who is not fully comfortable in the world, who is sort of struggling to make sense of the world, that's the paradigmatic experience of an immigrant. Right? That's the world Freud grew up in, right? As an immigrant in Vienna, as a city of immigrants, and that's the world of the 20th century. Of mass migration and dislocation and breakdown of tradition. Right? In a traditional world, everyone knows, right, what is in Fiddler on the Roof, right? Everyone knows who he is and what God expects him to be, right? And in the modern world, no one knows who he is, and no one knows what God expects him to be, or what we're supposed to be. And that's the world also of the the world of Freudian psychodynamics of we're not in control of ourselves. We don't know ourselves. We don't know what motivates us unless we invest an effort into really, the analysis effort into figuring it out. Page 32. The stories of the poor Jews in Central Europe in the 19th century tend to be generic rather than specific due to the lack and limits of such documentation. Freud's parents and grandparents would not have been interested in their lives in the way their son and grandson taught us to be. For these people, success was survival. The basic assumption of their lives was that there was nowhere that they could definitively settle, that their fate was to be always potentially nomadic because they had no political or civic status, living always on sufferance in foreign states. The modern individual, Sigmund Freud would eventually describe as a person under continuous threat with little knowledge of what was really happening to him. The ego, Freud would write, was not the master in its own house. The rider, he would write, in another telling analogy, has to guide the horse in the direction the horse wants to go. If mastery of one's life, of one's circumstances, is an unrealistic goal, he would wonder, what else should we be trying to do with our lives? That's a Jewish condition, Phillips is arguing. That's a Jewish condition in Central Europe in the 19th century. You're not the master of your own fate. You know wherever you are, that's not where you're necessarily going to be. And it's just, how much longer are we going to stay here? How much longer can we endure before we have to go somewhere else, before history pushes us elsewhere or destroys us altogether? That's also the world of Freud. That's the person that Freudian psychology describes.
So
not the master of his fate.
Freud? Is he diminishing
Phillips,
Freud?
no. Phillips is sort of situating him, and he's saying that sort of giving him situating him in a context. Right? He's saying the way he is describing human psychology is the way that he's describing human psychology in the way that he experienced the world, I think is what he's saying. Or he's noting a parallel, let's say.
So an Austrian who grew up in Austria went to public school there.
Would
it be different? Is that what he's...
This is something that Freud grappled with and was really concerned with. He was obsessed about this. Freud, almost all of his first students, many of his patients were Jewish. Vast majority of psychoanalysts into modern times have been Jewish, and Freud didn't like that. He was desperate for Gentile students because he didn't want psychoanalysis to be considered a Jewish science. That's why the break, Carl Jung, the break with Jung, who went off to, ended up really very sympathetic to the Nazis, which was like a real, the ultimate betrayal. But Freud stuck with him for so long because he was this brilliant Gentile student, and he was desperate for that, for psychoanalysis not to be considered a Jewish science. But maybe in some ways it describes another. I wouldn't say this. I would say modernity is Jewish. Okay, the modern condition is Jewish. That dislocation, right. So maybe I wouldn't say that. The experience of the Jew has became the experience of modern people, and that's what Freud is describing. Page 33 and on page right in the book. The modern liberal politics that Freud adhered to throughout his life would legitimate this dissent. Indeed, it gave reasons that justified dissent. It gave pictures of political consensus that involved the reconciliation of rival claims rather than consensus based on the repression of disagreement. In other words, Freud would construct a so-called model of the mind in which the repression of conflict, the refusal to acknowledge competing inner voices, was deemed to be the problem. What modern people suffered from in what became Freud's view as a psychoanalyst were spurious forms of internal consensus. Symptoms were states of conviction about the self isolated from differing points of view. In other words, just as you have your ego and your superego and your id, and they all have to kind of come to an agreement. Okay, you have all of your drives and your passions and your, right? And you can't repress, if you repress them, without resolving them, without forming consensus amongst your internal drives, there'll be problems. It'll sublimate in some symptomatic way. It'll be some self-destructive behavior or something like that. So that's also the model of politics that he was, right? You can't. That's the liberal political order. That you have different forces and different factions, and they want different things, and you have to figure out a way to have agreement between them without suppressing any one voice. So he's also describing his model of the mind is also a model of a liberal political order. Where the different factions are allowed to kind of to influence each other and to be in dialogue with each other without any voice being suppressed. But the Freud who would himself become at once a radical critic of religious belief and sexual mores was a politically naive liberal in fin de siècle Vienna, a man who most strikingly couldn't take the Nazis seriously until it was almost too late. Page 13. The second paragraph on page 13, to the top, we'll do both. Let's get the politics, as we can see in retrospect, was one of Freud's blind spots. The allure of a taken-for-granted liberalism, however wishful it seems with the wisdom of hindsight, the only wisdom Freud believed in, must have seemed irresistible to the Viennese Jews of Freud's generation. He had to be dragged out of Vienna with his immediate family, really, at the very last minute. Page 14. Freud, that is to say, came of age between two worlds, one perhaps dying and one powerless to be born. The world that was possibly dying and that was very nearly exterminated within 5 years of Freud's death was the world of traditional, more or less observant European Jewry. The world that was powerless to be born was the world of secular liberal democracy that would be at war with European fascism within months of Freud's death. Okay. So Freud and his Jewish identity, we opened right, we looked at that introduction to the Hebrew edition of Totem and Taboo. The most Freud's Moses by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi is a phenomenal book. It's based on, I think, 4 lectures he gave at Epilogue. So it's like very accessible, fairly accessible. Focusing on, among other things, that book Moses and Monotheism, like what was this book about? Why did Freud write it? Why did he delay publishing it for so long? What are the antecedents to this book? And then Freud grappling with this desperate search for Gentile students, his expressions of Jewish identity and support for Zionism and his conflicted Jewish identity, and then some final thoughts on psychoanalysis as a Jewish science. I thoroughly recommend the book. We can't do everything. Skip page 15. It's very good. We're going to skip it. Skip page 15. Page 16 we'll look at. In the course of the long engagement, Freud virtually bludgeons Martha into abandoning the Jewish rituals of her upbringing if she is to be his wife. Their correspondence is romantic and passionate, but he rails against her because to spare her mother's feelings on the Sabbath, she writes her letters in the garden using a pencil. She must, he insists, consent to eating ham and break with her mother's observances, for he is going to make a heathen out of her. In the end, he wants a civil marriage in Germany, but this would not be recognized in Austria. Furious, he tells his friends and collaborator Joseph Breuer that rather than face a Jewish religious ceremony, he would formally change his confession, a momentary overreaction from which Breuer was able to dissuade him by pointing out gently this was too complicated. Yet, all this was only one side of the coin. In the letter of 1882, the same Freud assures Martha that even if the form wherein the old Jews were happy no longer affords us any shelter, something of the core, of the essence of this meaningful and life-affirming Judaism will not be absent from our home. So there's some essence, right? Again, didn't believe in God, was not observant in any way, but he felt some attraction to something that was essentially Jewish that meant a lot to him. Something, yeah. I mean, that's the bottom of page 16, right? 1925. I can say that I stand as far from the Jewish religion as from all other religions. On the other hand, I have always had a strong feeling of belonging together with my people and have always nurtured it in my children as well. We have always remained in the Jewish denomination. Okay, so he gave a book to Herzl, a version of. He sent a copy of the Interpretation of Dreams to Herzl to review for his newspaper, and he wrote, please, if you don't write a review, he says, keep a copy for yourself, quote, as a token of the high esteem in which, for years now, I, like so many others, have held the writer and fighter for the human rights of our people. Right? His son joined the Zionist student group at the University of Vienna. He wasn't so sure if his father would be proud of him. He hesitated to tell him because Jewish citizens in distinguished positions had a strong prejudice against Zionism, and as far as I knew, he might easily regard my joining this club with disapproval. As it turned out, he was plainly delighted, and I may say now that many years later, he himself became an honorary member. So it's also interesting. On the other hand, in 1930, after the 1929, there were riots in Palestine, and the Jewish Agency asked prominent European Jews to write statements criticizing the British policy to prevent Jewish access to the Western Wall in Jerusalem and to limit Jewish immigration. And so Freud wrote, I cannot do what you wish. I am unable to overcome my aversion to burdening the public with my name, and even the present critical time does not seem to me to warrant it. Whoever wants to influence the masses must give them something rousing and inflammatory, and my sober judgment of Zionism does not permit this. I certainly sympathize with its goals. I'm proud of our university in Jerusalem, and I'm delighted with our settlement's prosperity, but on the other hand, I do not think that Palestine could ever become a Jewish state, nor that the Christian and Islamic worlds would ever be prepared to have their holy places under Jewish care. It would have seemed more sensible to me to establish a Jewish homeland on a less historically burdened land. But I know that such a rational viewpoint would never have gained the enthusiasm of the masses and the financial support of the wealthy. I concede with sorrow that the baseless fanaticism of our people is in part to be blamed for the awakening of Arab distrust. I can raise no sympathy at all for the misdirected piety which transforms a piece of an Herodian wall into a national relic, thus offending the feelings of the natives. Now judge for yourself whether I, with such a critical point of view, am the right person to come forward as the solace of a people deluded by unjustified hope. Okay? So he, and yet, 1935, he writes to somebody at the Karen HaYesod, I well know how great and blessed an instrument this foundation has become in its endeavor to establish a new home in the ancient land of our fathers. It is a sign of our invincible will to survive, which has until now successfully defied 2,000 years of severe oppression. Our youth will continue the struggle. So there's it's a Jewish pride, which is very, very strong. There's a identification with some Jewish essence as a core part of his identity, but certainly not religious and not even like nationalist in a conventional way. Let's move ahead to page 19. So Yerushalmi devotes really most of a chapter to exploring a very elaborate Hebrew poem that Freud's father wrote on a copy of the Torah, like a chumash, that he presented to Freud on his 30th birthday. He wrote it in very elaborate, embellished, like kind of rabbinic Hebrew, poetic Hebrew. On page 19, you can see a sort of a literal translation, which misses some of the allusions in the book. He has the Hebrew, if you can look at. So this also gives lie to Freud's statement, I don't know anything about Hebrew, I don't know anything. He seems to have had a much more traditional Jewish education than he admitted, as evidenced by this gift that his father gave him on his 30th birthday. It was shortly after his father died, though, that Freud really became very, very famous, but that's sort of interesting. But his father was sort of hoping that he would return to more Torah study, and Freud must have known Hebrew to have been given this inscription from his father. So, Yerushalmi ends his book with a kind of open letter to Freud, like a monologue, where he addresses Freud himself and says, okay, I wrote this book, I gave these lectures, tried to understand you, these are my questions. So look at page 98, which is page 20 of the handout. So far as I'm aware, from 1939, when there was already nothing left to lose, to the end of the Second World War, no official body of any official psychoanalytic organization ever raised its voice, not only over the destruction of Jews, but over the destruction of psychoanalysis itself, the one being part of the other. Nazi Germany and the lands it occupied, it was almost as though any overt linking of Jews and psychoanalysis were under a taboo. Right? That's sort of, again, that what does it mean that psychoanalysis is Jewish science, right? He wanted to be universal and scientific, and not limited to any, and yet psychoanalysts were mostly Jewish, right? And yet they didn't own that, they didn't say anything about that. But I carry, look at the page 99, but I carry within me a pent-up feeling and intuition that you yourself implied something more, something that you felt deeply, but would never dare to say. So I will take the risk of saying it. I think that in your innermost heart you believed that psychoanalysis is itself a further, if not final, metamorphosed extension of Judaism, divested of its illusory religious forms, but retaining its essential monotheistic characteristics, at least as you understood and described them. In short, I think you believed that just as you are a godless Jew, psychoanalysis is a godless Judaism. But I don't think you intended us to know this. Absurd possibly, but Domer Dach, perhaps after all. Okay, and that's sort of where Yerushalmi kind of ends his book. That maybe that's that what's essentially Jewish about Freud. That psychoanalysis is that quest of breaking idols and breaking with illusions is like a refined, secularized Judaism. Page 21 in the 70s. Is that right? 1977. There was a professorship in psychoanalysis that was created at Hebrew, endowed professorship named after Freud was endowed at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And in that year, the International Association of Psychoanalysis had its Congress in Jerusalem for the first time. And Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, gave a speech. And the first part of the speech, what role does psychoanalysis play in the university? And then she said the following. which is on page 21. During the era of its existence, psychoanalysis has entered into connection with various academic institutions, not always with satisfactory results. It has also repeatedly experienced rejection by them, being criticized for its methods being imprecise, its findings not open to proof by experiment, for being unscientific, or even for being a Jewish science. However, the other derogatory comments may be evaluated is, I believe, the last mentioned connotation, which, under present circumstances, can serve as a title of honor, she said in Jerusalem in 1977. And Yerushalmi ends his book, in fact, I will limit myself even further and be content if you answer only one question. When your daughter conveyed these words to the Congress in Jerusalem, was she speaking in your name? Please tell me, Professor, I promise I won't reveal your answer to anyone. So, I want to conclude, though, in this way. In the, Freudian psychoanalysis dominated American psychology in the mid-20th century, 1950s and 1960s. 70s, 80s, and 90s into the present, psychoanalysis has really diminished its influence in American psychology as really the role of the revolution in psychiatric medications, Prozac, and many other psychiatric drugs, seem to be more effective and also spoke to, were more efficient in relieving symptoms, and as managed care and the insurance industry sought more efficient forms of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis has really diminished in its impact in psychology. Although it still exists, I was raised amongst them. But where psychoanalysis is much stronger and has remained very influential is as a method of literary interpretation. And in literature departments, psychoanalysis is a common method. And one individual in particular, there are among others who have used psychoanalysis in sort of psychoanalytic thinking in very fruitful literary analysis of Torah, is Aviva Zornberg, who is a contemporary living scholar who lives in Jerusalem. And she's been teaching and writing for many, many years. She just actually published a book in this Yale series on Moses, she wrote a psychological profile of Moses, and she draws in her, she teaches, she lectures all over the place in Jerusalem. She lectures on the Parsha every week. She comes to America, you should hear her speak, she's fantastic. She uses Parshanut, Rashi, Ramban, Midrash, classical sources, heavily uses use of Hasidic sources, and she also uses psychoanalytic theory as well in her analysis of Torah. So I thought we'd look at a little piece from this week's Parsha. Right, God gets a little angry at Moses, because he's like, what's going to happen? I can't do this mission. Let's just see okay. God's anger remains mysterious. This is indeed the first time in the Torah that God is described as being angry. Rashi, in a selection of sources, conveys a sense of the moral and imaginative complexity of the situation. How is God's anger, in fact, to be imagined? Particularly if we adopt Rashi's Oedipal reading. Moses seems to have, meaning Moses doesn't compete with his brother, right? His brother Aaron is older. Moses is deferential. Okay, Moses seems to have good reasons for refusing the offered role. The sincerity is proved by his later serene response to his brother's promotion, and yet there is a moment of profound disruption. Moses stands against the will of God and refuses to speak. Rashi's reading, the Oedipal taboo, does not serve to justify Moses in the face of God's anger. Right? So it takes Aviva Zornberg to say that Rashi is focusing on Oedipal taboo in Moshe's reluctance to usurp his older brother Aaron's place as the senior prophet. One might say that there is a sense of the hidden, the unexpressed in the drama of resistance. Just as Rashi's reading intimates that it is the brothers' relationship that explains this resistance, a perception not at all blatantly obvious in the text, so I would suggest the very reference to the uncanny relationship that we now call the Oedipus complex is a way of indicating the largest, the most inchoate experiences of resistance. Moses' sensitivity to the claims of the Gadol, the older brother, the father, is perhaps the displaced sensitivity to the hidden father of his life, Pharaoh himself. For Moses' relation to the Egyptian king is bizarre in the extreme. Adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, he is effectively grandson to Pharaoh, a dimension of the narrative that is never conspicuous. For this very reason, one might say, precisely because the Torah text does not draw attention to this paradoxical intimacy between the major antagonists, we should become alert to what lies just beneath the explicit conscious level of the narrative. The fact that Moses finally kills Pharaoh at the Red Sea, an Oedipal act in the clearest sense, is blurred in many ways. In entering the Red Sea, he acts at the command of God. Pharaoh is not his father, but his grandfather. Pharaoh is not literally his grandfather, but the radical tension between the antagonists is fed by the fact that Moses has a dual identity, Egyptian and Hebrew. If he is a son of Amram and Yocheved, he is also a son of Pharaoh. This paradox lies at the heart of the narrative. In his infancy, according to a famous legend, Moses was the object of an infanticidal attempt by Pharaoh. At 3 years old, he took Pharaoh's crown from his head and put it on his own. Pharaoh's advisors, led by Bilam, urged that the child be put to death. Clearly, his gesture is one of usurpation. He aims, like all his Israelite ancestors, to overthrow the superior, the elder rival. The angel Gabriel, disguised as one of the Egyptian sages, proposes a test to determine if there is a precocious intent behind the infant. You know this story, right? People know the Midrash, right? So he touches, I'll read it, okay. An onyx stone and a burning coal are placed before him. He reaches for the coal, brighter but worthless. He will prove that he is just an infant attracted to the shiny. If he reaches for the valuable stone, he will prove his precociousness and the sinister nature of his self-crowning. Moses, who was indeed precociously wise and destined to overthrow Pharaoh, reaches for the stone, but Gabriel supernaturally diverts his hand towards the coal. He burns his hand, puts it instinctively to his mouth, burning that as well. This gesture saves his life and also explains how he becomes heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. As Rabbi Paul suggests, Moses' speech defect thus can be understood as the scar left by a failed infanticidal attack. Like Oedipus' wounded feet, he has survived his father's fatal attack. Later he will kill this father at the Red Sea. In the interim, Pharaoh will again seek to kill him in punishment for killing the Egyptian taskmaster. Two paternal attacks on his life provide the filicidal justification for his own ultimate act of parricide. Okay? So, what's your source? Sources it's Midrash. This is Rashi, this is the Midrash. That's all she has. That's the only text it's the Torah, it's Rashi, it's Midrash, but it's brought to life by Freudian theories of the Oedipal complex that explain like this hidden secret element of the story that we've read and heard hundreds of times, year after year, and yet sort of it's given life. Okay, and this is where I think Freud maybe is most alive today, and certainly in academies, and it's as a tool for interpreting literature, and that certainly can be used for interpreting Torah as well. So. I think with this I'll pause in respect for your time. Next week we will look at Marx, and following that we have guest teachers from our shul. We have a lecture on Spinoza and a lecture on Paul of Tarsus. Okay, two other radical renegade Jews. Okay, thank you so much and good evening.